վարքերը, մեր խնդիրները գալիս է հենց այդ մեր ներսի խառը վիճակից, որ աղաղա, այսօր հրավիրի Տիրոջը, և ինչպես կիրակի օրն ենք խոսում, թող քո մեջից խաղաղության աղյուրը բխի։ Եկեք միասին աղոթենք և Եհովա շալոմը կառուցենք մեր ընտանիքներում։ Շատ զոհասեղաններ ես կառուցել, շատ զոհեր ես արել, շատ բաներ ես արել Աստծո համար, բայց ինչ օգուտ, եթե Եհովա շալոմը չկա, մեջդ խաղաղություն չկա։ Գուցե հանգիստ ես երևում առ երևույթ, բայց խորքումդ հրաբուխ կա, արձակի այդ Տիրոջ ներկայության մեջ։ Կարող ես աղաղակով արձակես, կարող ես արցունքով արձակես, կարող ես միայն բառերով արձակես, բայց ասա, որ Տեր, շնորհակալ եմ, որ ինձ ասում ես մի վախենա, խաղաղություն քեզ։ Եվ շնորհակալ եմ, որ ես կարող եմ այդ սեղանը շինել։ Գիտեք, այս սեղանը ոչ թե մի հատ լուր խաղաղության սեղան էր, այլ այս սեղանը մի ցատկեփայտ էր գորքերը քանդելու, մի ցատկեփայտ էր զորքերը հավաքելու, մի ցատկեփայտ էր մեծ օծություն վերցնելու եւ մադյանցիների բազմահազար զորքերին հաղթելու համար։
Բարերեգո սիրելի հարնագիստներ, ինչպես եւ սիրելի եղբայրներ քույրեր, ինչպես ամեն շաբաթ խոստացանք ամեն երեքշաբթի երեգո ժամը 7-8-ը ցեզեդուղի եթեր պիտի ունենանք ավասիկ այսօր պիտի խոսենք շատ կազմիական կարևոր հարցի մասին, կարևոր անձնավորության մասին, անգլերենով պիտի դնենք, պիտի փորձեմ որ չափ որ կարողանամ հայերենով թարգմանել, բայց գլխավոր նյութը այսօրվա անգլերենով պիտի լա, որովհետեւ մեր հյուրը ինքը ամերիկացի եւ անգլիախոս է ավելի ճիշտ է։ Ուրեմն մեր հյուրն այսօրվա Pastor Mark Dankof շատ հետաքրքիր անձնավորություն բնե որ Սեն Անտոնիոյի մեջ Գաբրի եւ ոնդեղը պաստորություն գնե եւ իրեն գլխավորությամբ մոտ 2000 թվականին Delaware-ի Senate-ի ռեյսի անդամ էր եւ Ugly Truth Mark Dankof Ugly Truth Voice of America-ի խոսնագն է քաղաքական եզրակացություններ միտքեր դվողն է եւ շատ հարկելի անձնավորություն ունե միջազգային կետնի վրա դարբեր մեծ TV-ներ իրեն խորհուրդ գանում որպես analyst. Mark, I'm not going to represent you very long because our show is going to take about an hour to represent you because of your credentials. But as far as thank you for coming to our show first of all. I thank you for taking your time, precious time, in responding and coming to our show.
Great privilege to be here and to work with you, my friend. Every time we've worked together, I've always enjoyed the experience.
I will start with a very important question. As we see in a political arena, we see all the interesting political resolutions, all these big meetings that is taking place, Geneva meetings, all the peace negotiations, but we haven't seen any results because it has not been in the best interest of some few that are the globalists and trying to destroy the world population, and apparently they're talking about peace. I want to also connect this with end-day prophecies, eschatology, as we know, because we've been pre-told all about these issues that we see and hear, and we're living in those days. I would like to have your opinion on this a little bit.
Well, I think we look at end times prophecies as Christians. There are a number of places that we could turn to. The Olivet Discourse is one, Matthew 24, Mark 13, and Luke 21, where Jesus speaks very definitively about the signs of the end of time, signs that will precede his second coming. Then, of course, there are many other passages just in the New Testament alone that deal with this. First Thessalonians chapter 4, 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, which gives us some indications in regard to this individual that we know as the Antichrist. Certainly the Petrine epistles and the book of Jude get into some of this material. And then quite obviously John's Apocalypse. But to return to Jesus' Olivet Discourse just for a moment, I think the striking thing, as I was saying to Dr. David Duke on his show today, is that when we look at the Olivet Discourse, perhaps the most critical theme that runs throughout is deception. Jesus makes it very clear that deception will be particularly paramount in the end times of history. It will be a deception that will be so sophisticated and so virulent and have so much satanic power connected to it that, as he puts it, were it possible, even the very elect would be deceived, and that the elect will not be deceived only because the Lord will graciously shorten the days. And when we look at this deception, as I said to Dr. Duke today, and as you and I have talked about it, Bedros, the deception has some very significant qualitative content. Deception generally, yes, but I think Jesus is alluding to a specific deception, specific end times deception, that I think is tied up, frankly, with the heresy of Christian Zionism, is tied up with Christian Zionism in terms of the way in which John Nelson Darby in the 19th century and subsequently the Scofield Reference Bible began to permeate American Protestant evangelical thinking and European evangelical thinking from the time that that volume first appeared, courtesy of the funding given to by the Rothschild dynasty, courtesy of their Oxford University Press. And certainly when we look at the present circumstance as it exists in the world, and we're looking at all of the things that the Bible tells us, both about the Antichrist and about the global one-world system that the Antichrist will head up, and the way in which this seems to be intimately connected to an international central banking system, it seems to be intimately connected to a worldwide deception that certainly is being facilitated today by the folks who control corporate media around the world. And then when you look just at the American government alone, not to mention many other world governments that we could talk about, we are reminded of what Paul tells us in Ephesians chapter 6, that when it comes to this whole business of world governments, Paul says we're not wrestling with flesh and blood. We're dealing with powers, with principalities, with spiritual wickedness in high places. This is definitely a reference on Paul's part to the satanic character of the deceptions that will occur throughout history through various governments of the world, and that all of this certainly, according to Jesus, will intensify as we approach the end of time, as we begin to see this globalist system unfolding, and as we try to identify who the major players are in this world system and what their agenda is. And E. Michael Jones of Culture Wars, I think, has done a good job from a Roman Catholic perspective in identifying something that Lutherans and Eastern Orthodox people and responsible, non-deceived Protestant evangelicals can agree on, and that is that the whole business of the so-called synagogue of Satan, which is a term that Jesus used to with several of the churches, the Church of Smyrna and the Church of Philadelphia, the two best churches among the seven churches that are critiqued in the opening chapters of John's Apocalypse, the so-called seven churches of Asia Minor, that this synagogue of Satan reference is not simply talking about the dynamics that were going on in the persecutions of the early confessing Church of Christ in the first century, but I think Michael Jones does an outstanding job in explaining how this synagogue of Satan theme is a constant thread that we see recurring time and again throughout 20 and now 21 centuries of world history. And again, going back to Jesus and the Olivet Discourse and the whole theme of deception, we understand it's global. We understand it's particularly satanic. We understand that as the grace of God, no one would escape the tentacles of this thing. And again, I'm convinced, as a number of people are who've begun delving into this in greater detail, that the Christian Zionist heresy and the pro-Zionist deception that has taken over much of Protestant evangelicalism is arguably the glue that will hold this deception together, I believe, in the end times.
Well, the key word you said at the beginning was the deception, the greatest deception that is taking place and has been taking place. Infiltration of the church, infiltration of the Word of God, changing things geopolitically or let's say theologically. And we see all the education systems starting from United States that had to do with the end-time prophecy. The educational system that took more lean to atheism and liberalism, which the roots of it we can see it had the identical DNA of deception to control masses, for example. And as we see with this, the same deception has been controlled in the media, the same media that propagandas against the people of this world, against certain governments that they don't obey their rule of law. And I want to go for now with the same deception, Syrian issue. What is your take on that in the Syrian issue? My take, I've said it many times on television, on Armenian TV, especially now, for the past 2 weeks, we've been receiving videos of Armenians who are forcefully being converted into Islam or being beheaded. We have the videos and we have the confessions and we have all the evidences that the world has kept quiet for some reason. When it comes time to prosecute Christians, the world is quiet. When it comes time to prosecute liberal homosexuals, all of a sudden we have to learn about tolerance. Starting from Syria, as a matter of fact, I want to hear your input on it.
Well, I think when we look at Syria, it is very, very clear that there is a nefarious alliance going on between the Zionist state of Israel, the neoconservatives in the American government and in the American media who are aligned with Israel and with global Zionism, and the Saudi Arabian regime in the support of these Wahhabic fanatics. I've also seen them referred to as takfiris, connected to, in many cases, Al-Qaeda or Al-Qaeda affiliated splinter groups, and that this is all designed to overthrow President Assad of Syria. Simply, at one level, the Sunnis want this, apparently, because President Assad is not only a member of the Alawite Shia sect, and therefore considered to be the enemy of these Sunni fanatics and these Sunni governments, but also President Assad regime in Syria would seem to be the one Arab regime that we could identify as being particularly close to Iran. And in this regard, this has resulted in the targeting clearly of the Assad government. And if we go back in terms of deception and look at the way that this conflict has been covered by the Western media, for the longest time, Assad was being demonized in the West media, still is in many respects. We were told that this whole situation in Syria was a civil war, and that the good guys wanted to get Assad out, and that what we needed, to quote various American neoconservatives of great prominence, was regime change, quote unquote. Right. It's obvious to me that this is a part of the package of the Bernard Lewis crowd, the Project for the American Century crowd, now known as the Foreign Policy Initiative, that in fact this is nothing more than a euphemism for global Zionism and the New World Order, tied up with the international banking system, and tied up with wanting to see the present regime in Iran destroyed and brought to heel. And when you look at this whole situation, it's clear now that most of these people fighting Assad are people who have been imported into that country from the outside, right, with a full blessing of the United States and Jordan and Turkey, and with the direct involvement primarily of Saudi Arabia. And it's clear that the Israeli Mossad has its fingerprints in all of this as well. And when you look at this situation, it's abundantly clear what the agenda is. The Sunnis want Assad out. The United States wants Assad out because the Zionists want Assad out. And if they were successful in doing that, it would be a prelude, presumably, to an overt attack on Iran, which is what Netanyahu and the Zionists have been lobbying for with the American government and continue to do so. It would also be another way, presumably, where the forces involved in all of this would continue trying to marginalize, among others, Vladimir Putin and Russia. So this is all tied up in this. And clearly, when we look at these horrible atrocities that these Wahhabic fanatics have committed up to and including these beheadings of these Armenian Christians, we get back to what Pat Buchanan has had the courage to publicly observe, and that is that the loss of the Assad regime in Syria will mean untold death and destruction. It will mean the displacement of untold numbers of people. But Buchanan quite correctly identified the 2 million Christians living in Syria who would be especially prone to victimization at the hands of what would be some type of Sunni / Wahhabic / Takfiri regime. And that this is the way that things played out for the Christians in Palestine. It's the way that things played out for Christians in Iraq, and most notably, going back to something you could speak far more eloquently about than I, it gets back to the first part of the 20th century and what happened to your people, the Armenian people, at the hands of the Turks, as the world stood by largely and allowed that to happen, and did not really care to identify who the real forces were, the driving forces were, in what happened to the Armenian nation then, that arguably are the same forces working now in the Syrian situation to produce another tragedy there with a bigger game plan in mind.
Absolutely, with a bigger game plan in mind, but first they had to destroy the Christian civilization from that part of the world, and which they successfully did through pan-Turkism and their ideology. Then they slowly, first Christian nations, for example, Lezgins, Avars, Talish, those were Christian nations. They invaded and converted their religious beliefs, and we see slowly but surely they're accomplishing their goals into bringing all of a sudden new world government and new world order, which was stated by Father Bush in 90s, I believe, or 80s.
And I think that that's an important point. I'd like to get back to the homosexual thing, too, here in just a second. But you've identified George Herbert Walker Bush quite rightly as one who really openly spoke about the New World Order when he was elected as President of the United States on the Republican ticket in 1988. This is a critical thing to be aware of and to understand because like earlier today at the gymnasium when I was working out on the high-speed treadmill and watching this dreadful Fox News podcast, clearly it's designed to divert thinking people from really understanding the issues, and clearly it's designed to create a Republican versus Democrat dialectic, or a so-called conservative versus liberal dialectic that in many cases, if not most cases, deliberately obscures the identity of the real players in this thing and what they're doing not only worldwide, but what they've had particular success doing in Europe and in the United States in the 20th century. Now, this gets into something that relates to a topic that Dr. Kevin McDonald and Dr. E. Michael Jones would know far more about than I hasten to say. But the so-called Frankfurt School, its so-called Institute of Social Research, that was particularly significant and powerful in the Weimar Republic in Germany before the advent of Hitler. When we ask who these people are and what their agenda is, we discover that the Frankfurt School, and the so-called Institute of Social Research connected with the Frankfurt School in the Weimar Republic in Germany was overwhelmingly Jewish. It was overwhelmingly Jewish in who was staffing it, who was financing it, the very close relationship of the Frankfurt School with the Anti-Defamation League. All of this is chronicled in Sigmund Freud's own diary, by the way. E. Michael Jones has published some of what's in the Freud diary that sheds unbelievable light on the bigger picture here. Well, the point is that when Hitler came to power in Germany, for better or worse, these people that were connected to this Frankfurt School and its Institute of Social Research fled. Where did they flee? Well, E. Michael Jones tells where they fled. They came to the United States and formed the core of a largely Jewish neo-Marxist element that infiltrated, among other places, the Ivy League schools, the University of Chicago and Hyde Park, South Chicago. The University of California, Berkeley was another major center for these folks. And their agenda was largely to infiltrate the United States in the same way that they had been largely successful doing it in Europe, with a New World Order agenda that would be brought about by the advocacy, undercover at first, more obvious later, the advocacy of abortion on demand, the advocacy of the homosexual rights movement and every form of sexual perversion. They enlisted Hollywood and other elements in the American media in producing what I think was basically what the psychologists would call a systematic desensitization of American society. The American society, for example, as recently as the early 1960s, was a far less liberal place than what we have today over 50 years later, when now we're talking about the legalization of homosexual marriages, the full support of the Attorney General of the United States, and I'm sure the Supreme Court of the United States ultimately, and the President of the United States in supporting this stuff. These folks now have an open freeway for them in the American military, with all of the implications of that. And when you start looking at what this has done to the United States, the homosexuality, the out of wedlock pregnancies, which have increased exponentially in all of these different racial groupings since 1960. And then you look at what abortion has done, not simply to the soul of the country, but how it has altered the demographics of the United States in very, very critical ways. That, plus the increasing facilitation of immigration policies that were designed to break down specifically what had been, in a larger sense of the word, in a generic sense of the word, the older Christian culture in the United States. All of this traces back to this Frankfurt School, this Institute of Social Research, that Hitler correctly identified as a subversive element that was going to bring Bolshevism to Germany if it was allowed to continue. Well, these folks left Germany, of course, at the end of the Weimar Republic. The bad news is that they infiltrated American educational institutions, and all of these many years later have produced a situation where the father of the gay rights movement in the United States, a Jew by the name of Kameny, K-A-M-E-N-Y, just a handful of years ago before his death, had an official meeting in the Oval Office with Barack Obama, where he was officially recognized by the President of the United States as one of the greatest living Americans. Barney Frank and Joe Lieberman and other minions of the Jewish establishment were standing right behind President Obama when he was officially recognizing this guy and giving him an award. Fact of the matter is, if you look into Frank Kameny more closely, not only was he a homosexual pervert, but Kameny made it very clear in his own writings that his version of Americanism, quote unquote, involved a brand of sexual liberty that would legalize bestiality, that would get rid of age of consent laws between adults and minors, all kinds of the sickest, most demonic things that you can imagine, that again have continued to push the envelope in the United States in regard to what is morally acceptable. And as far as that envelope has been pushed in the last 50 years, I think it's quite noteworthy that when you look at the European societies, when you look at the United States and North America, when you look at what has been called the UK, that these are post-Christian societies. Right. They're post-Christian societies that have been infiltrated from within by the elements of this Frankfurt School, this Institute of Social Research that came out of Weimar, Germany. This is a largely Jewish movement. We have to say that publicly. It's a fact that it is. People want to research this online. They'll discover how true that is. And the kind of infiltration, moral infiltration and spiritual infiltration of these Western countries is part and parcel, I think, of the bigger picture of what Jesus was talking about in Matthew 24 in the Olivet Discourse when he was speaking of deception and when he was speaking in the end times of a deception that would be so great that were it possible, he says, even the very elect would be deceived. Right. And as I said on David Duke's show today, when you're looking at the pornography industry, the abortion industry, the homosexual and lesbian rights movement, and all the rest of it, these are probably movements, as E. Michael Jones has proven, and people like Kevin McDonald have proven, are largely Jewish-staffed and Jewish-financed movements that, working in tandem with this move toward an economic globalism, have largely destroyed the formerly Christian cultures of the Western world. And then, of course, that has implications in turn for what it is that the United States and Britain, among others, are doing in participating with Saudi Arabia behind the scenes and participating with Israel behind the scenes in these terrible things going on in Syria, which now have involved the martyrdoms of these Armenian Christians there.
Well, when we go back to the book of Skulls and Bones and we see the decisions of the curriculums, how they were supposed to separate the curriculums within the school system, that's when, well, as we know, the American public school system started from Sunday school system. If we read the history of public school, because those that had a poverty issue, they were poor, they were usually, they went into Sunday school in order to get some education. But eventually, when these curriculums were written from 1860s prior to Germany, we see their decisions of how to break down the curriculum into certain classes, certain divisions of individuals. Certain people supposed to be doctors, certain supposed to be janitors, and their educational level was supposed to be controlled. Another issue they took, as you know, the drug issue, medication, over-medicated people. Well, that's the biggest issue that we have in the United States. It's one of the highest medicated country in the world, as we see. And those medications are drugs, of course. And anytime somebody or some doctor talks about natural medication, they attack and shut down, and they even incarcerate the individual. On the other hand, if we see the solution of the United States right here, what has happened, they've been, the way they infiltrated, when they took Christianity, Christian values out, we know about, there was a statistics on Fox News, I was listening, 40% of white generations, they've been incarcerated in the United States. 50% of African Americans will be been incarcerated. So those are, if you talk about, if we sit down and think about how many millions of people have been incarcerated based on their laws, based on their regulations, harsh regulation, man-made regulations that has nothing to do with God, we see there is a constant attack on Christian values and Christianity, specifically. When they take the word or the wisdom of Christ out of a person, that person becomes and starts acting animalistic, as we know. So regarding to Syria, not only Syria, we see in the picture, according to those that want to create a temple for Satan, as we know, it's going to be the chair for Satan, and it's going to rule the world directly from that temple.
Second Thessalonians 2, right. Exactly. Specifically
speaks. I don't want anybody to get a misunderstanding. This is cultural or religious war. This is specifically a war between gods. The God of our gods, the God of the Bible, and the God of the world, Satan himself. So we have to put a differentiation and understand the geopolitics of wanting to create greater Israel and what's the purpose behind it. To control and to occupy more lands, to kill individuals in the name of fight against terrorism. When will this end, according to you?
Well, I think it will end only with the second coming of Jesus Christ. That's my take on it. I think we are truly in an age, as Jesus tells us in the Olivet Discourse, where we will constantly hear of wars and rumors of war. That's another basic theme of the Olivet Discourse. And when you look at this whole business of so-called Greater Israel, the Jewish Defense League of the United Kingdom published something that I saw on Facebook a couple of days ago, which basically lays out the claim of these modern Zionists, many of whom are communists and atheists, by the way, but not yet nonetheless they tried to give certain Old Testament passages their spin when convenient, to argue that they have a claim in all of these territories. It's not simply Palestine that we're speaking of here. This concept of Greater Israel, which is found, as I understand it, in the constitutions of virtually all of the major political parties in Israel, is speaking about a concept where Israel will extend from the Nile River to the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. It will consume most of Lebanon. It will move into parts of Saudi Arabia. And when you see this map, that it's very clear that it's not just the Palestinians that are being crushed under the heel of this thing, but it's many other indigenous peoples of that region who are over time going to lose their land too, to the likes of these Zionist fanatics who unfortunately are being supported by these so-called Christian leaders in the United States who are on the Zionist payroll, including John Hagee of Cornerstone Church here in San Antonio, the head of the so-called Christians United for Israel, who basically is teaching a heretical two-covenant theology, among many other things, that indicate to me, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that in terms of historic Christian orthodoxy, this man is a heretic, and yet he has clearly been bankrolled, according to the American Free Press, to the tune of about $150 million as far as his personal empire is concerned. Much of that money coming from Zionists. It's not an accident that Hagee links up to all of the big wigs of the neoconservative movement in Washington. From time to time, he's named Man of the Year by the Anti-Defamation League here in San Antonio as well as nationally. And he shows up in all these creepy places, including his alliance with a very shadowy Jewish rabbi who will be seen on television periodically, Rabbi Yichael Eckstein, the head of the so-called International Fellowship of Christians and Jews, which is an amazing conduit for siphoning money from misguided and deceived Christian Zionists that is going into the coffers of this world globalist Zionist New World Order movement. These guys, whatever else we might say about them, they're satanic in my view. They're evil. They're a part of the deception that Jesus speaks of, and their effectiveness is not simply linked to the fact that they are very skilled, ingenious people, humanly speaking, but I believe beyond a shadow of a doubt that when we understand Jesus' words clearly, when we understand the warnings of Paul and Peter and John in the Apocalypse, there is a satanic power, there is a demonic influence that undergirds these people and that is behind so much of what we are presently seeing in the world, so much so that they've even got this thing down to a point where those who are not Zionists, those who might choose to speak out publicly from a pulpit about the misuse and perversion of Scripture on the part of these people, may discover that the 501c3 tax status of their church can be revoked, at the same time that John Hagee can have 100 different front groups operating for the government of Israel, and the IRS never looks into his activities, of course. This comes up even with more mainstream figures historically, like Billy Graham, where you read some of the things that his son Franklin Graham has been putting out in recent times in Decision magazine. And when you see names like Frank Gaffney for the Center of Security Policy being cited as credible sources of information on the Middle East, this guy, in my view, is widely believed by informed people in Washington to be little more than an asset of the Israeli government and the Zionist movement globally. So this is the nature of the deception, and what is particularly amazing to me, and this came up on Duke's show today, that when you look at all of the anti-Christ political positions and ideologies that are supported by this global Zionist entity and by its lobby in the United States specifically, you have all of these evangelical Christians who claim to decry homosexual perversion and pornography and abortion on demand and all of these other things, but virtually none of them speak. Their leaders certainly don't speak about who it is that is the disproportionate influence globally in financing this stuff and staffing this stuff and infiltrating societies with it. And of course, I have said to people, for example, in Iran that I occasionally talk with who have press television connections, I just tell them, I said, when you look at how effective this stuff has been in changing the whole character of Europe and the United States, the people of Iran, just as one example, and the people of Syria need to understand that it's not simply the utilization of paramilitary forces and espionage agents and the threat of overt military force that threatens the survivability of these countries, but it's not an accident. And E. Michael Jones has talked about this to some extent. There was an article in the Foreign Affairs Journal a while back written by an Iranian with Oxford University connections that talked about this. The whole issue of sex and sexual freedom and what you and I would refer to as, in Christian terms, as sexual perversion, is very much on the minds of these advocates of the New World Order in trying to undermine the societal order in these Islamic societies in the same way that they've done it in the formerly Christian societies of Europe and the United States. And this is how the game is played. They have many arrows in their quiver, and I think we can anticipate that younger generations of people in countries like Iran and Syria are going to be especially targeted with pornography and other things as a means of breaking down their will to resist the iron fist of the New World Order, and what you and I and other Christians, Bedros, believe will be a New World Order headed up by the Antichrist, referred to in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2 by Paul, clearly ruling from a rebuilt temple in Jerusalem, by the way. That ought to suggest that we reevaluate some of Mr. Hagee's thinking about this. And this is the same individual in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, John on the island of Patmos, writing the Apocalypse during the reign of Domitian between 81 and 96 AD, identifies in Revelation 13 as the beast. The beast and the false prophet, we are told there, and both of them serving the dragon, who is Satan. And when I look at the false prophet, who basically provides a deceptive religious aura for the agenda of the beast, one can argue that the false prophet may well be some version of a Christian Zionist playing second fiddle to the beast in regard to the imposition of all that we see going on in the world right now. The point is, eschatology does matter. The point is, I think we are living in those days, and frighteningly enough, Christian Zionists in the United States, disproportionately represented in the Protestant evangelical community in the States and in Europe, are falsely identifying those of us who are Christians and who disagree with this maniacal view of prophecy, this heretical view of prophecy. They're accusing us, for example, of being un-American because we don't support Israel. All real Americans support Israel. This is the same Israel, of course, that gave us the Lavon affair, that gave us the Pollard spy case, that gave us the attack on the USS Liberty on June the 8th, 1967. This is the same Israel that's trying to drag this country right now into a war that will benefit these globalist interests and that will not benefit the average American at all. And yet the way in which we are being prepared for this catastrophe suggests that potentially millions of Americans will be deceived into supporting something that they believe falsely should be supported by American nationalists and Christians, when in fact the real agenda behind this is anything but those things.
That's very clear, and that's, you can't be more accurate on that issue than we talked about the deception, the greatest deception that started started prior to crucifixion of Christ, but after his resurrection, they infiltrated and infiltrated and infiltrated, as we see the results right now. I would like to ask you also one more issue. Armenians and other Christians lived among Muslims for years and years and thousands of years, for 1,500 years together in peace. All of a sudden, Ottoman Empire decided through the Young Turks to create a genocide and blame it on Muslims. Obviously, it was the Pan-Turkism, the main instrument on that, which created the genocide, and for a certain purpose, I don't want to talk about it today. But my goal of this idea is right now, other Christians and Armenians lived in Middle East for years and hundreds of years and thousands of years, together, next being neighbors. All of a sudden, we see extreme Muslims. For example, I will give you an idea. United States and the West has demonized Iran as being extremist, but Armenians lived there for hundreds of years doing their business without being pressured. We know that. And we thank the Iranians for that, for their nobility towards us. Same with Middle East, Lebanese, Syrians, and all those ethnic minorities and nationalities. We lived next to each other for years and thousands of years. Right now we see, all of a sudden, through this demonic Saudi empire, let's say, forceful Islamization or trying to forcefully Islamize individuals. What would you identify? Is this the true Islam, or is it let's say, Islamic Zionism?
Well, that's an interesting term, Islamic Zionism. That would seem like a contradiction in terms, but maybe it's not so contradictory when we understand the nature of this Zionist Saudi alliance in Syria, where this is clearly at work. To me, in order to understand this, there are certain general principles that I think apply. One is that when you start talking about the people who control the New World Order, who are going to impose it down to the last inch of the earth if they're successful in imposing it. These are people who, whether it's manipulating currencies through the central banking system, destroying societies economically with extortionist interest rates and other things, causing artificial depressions or whatever, or utilizing coups d'etats and assassinations to bring about regimes that will do the bidding of the New World Order, whether it's overt military attacks on societies who resist them. The Iranians have been resisting them in recent years, much credit, by the way, or the utilization, again, of a Frankfurt School type of neo-Marxist social agenda to bring about the acceptance of sexual perversion and abortion on demand and all of these other things, pornography into play in the country in question, or pitting people against each other who have not historically had major problems living with one another, but these tensions are being exacerbated by an outside force in order that people might not understand who the real enemy is, and in order that people might be representing these different constituencies might be weakened, might be progressively destroyed, might be progressively disillusioned and marginalized to such an extent that they then become ripe for takeover by the New World Order. This is, I think, what has gone here. And when you look at the United States, just in the United States alone, look at all of the false dialectic that we are presented with every day by CNN and Fox News, just to name two, where people that watch these telecasts would be forgiven for believing that the biggest issue is white versus black racially, or the biggest issue is Christian versus non-Christian, where the issue may well be rich versus poor and so forth. Now, each of those issues may have some merits in terms of consideration, but the fact of the matter is, when we look at who inflames these tensions and who benefits from so doing, I think arguably the one group that has benefited the most from this sort of thing in American society has been the Jews, the Zionists. And I think that this is true as well in the Middle East. When you see what happened in Lebanon, when you see what's going on right now in Syria, when we look at the tragedy in Armenia in the first part of the 20th century, who are the real players behind all of this, and what is the agenda? I think their agenda is clear. It is to expand the borders of greater Israel and to take over all of Jerusalem. By the way, this is where our New Testament tells us that the New World Order will be governed from. It's important that we understand. David Duke referred to this a little bit on the air today. Zionism, and he said on the air, and I know he said that Mark agrees with this, he said Zionism goes well beyond the question of who controls Palestine. It is a global movement. It is a New World Order movement. It desires to bring about the governance of the planet by a specific group of people, and to divert people's attention from this with a educational system, news media, and a government that have been co-opted by these people in the United States and elsewhere, and by keeping other peoples who are not a part of this group, who are not a part of this power elite, to keep them from unifying against it by turning them against each other. And I think this is where these tragedies that have happened in the Middle East in the last 100 years emanate from.
We've been receiving a couple of phone calls, and some of them seem like it's from outside of the United States, but since we don't have lots of time to give to the air, maybe we can do some other time, and we have to, we will get in depth with the eschatological aspect of what's coming up, the real fear that we're waiting for. Of course, those that are saved in the blood of Christ and they're walking in the path of Christ, they have no fear to fear. They have no worries to worry about. But we're talking about, finally, I would like to conclude this with few words. In the same revelation, we see about the coming of Christ, but before coming of Christ, we see specifically the mark of the beast. But I will take one phone. Let's see what people have to say. Are you listening?
Yes. Are we live?
Yes, you are live.
Okay. Thank you, Bedros. A fantastic program with Pastor Dankof. I'd just like to offer an alternative point of view with regards to the war on Islam. You know, Christianity, the Christian world, except for in a very few places, but certainly what we would consider the Western Christian world, it has been destroyed in the sense that our moral fiber is gone. You've spent a good portion of the program tonight talking about all of these plagues that have destroyed the Christian West, pornography, abortion, and all of these other things. You know, the Islamic world is the one place where they seem to have an immunity to these things. We have not been able to corrupt them and destroy them from within the way that has happened to the Christian world. And I think that this is the reason why our common enemy has decided to utilize the Christian world and its military and its economic might to actually go and to physically destroy be honest in our appraisal here, that the Christian world has been replaced in terms of its morality with the Islamic world. The Islamic world is the only place left where family matters and where all of the natural law that God has handed down to us from the beginning still exists. And so I think that this is the reason why our common enemy here wants to see us mutually destroy each other. And that is exactly what they have in store for the Christian world after we have outlived our usefulness in terms of destroying the culture and the religion of 1.5 billion Muslims around the world. Then they will take the same knife that they have used to destroy the Islamic world, and they will put it to our throat as well. I'd like to get your commentary on that, please.
Sure. I will take one more phone call before we comment that. Yes, you are online?
Yes, hello?
Yes.
I said speaking the truth, and I just want to tell you that I think the second coming of Christ is the second coming of Adolf Hitler and the second coming of National Socialism. That's all I have to say.
Thank you. Mark, I would like to get your input on the first comment, the phone call.
Well, I think the first caller is identifying basically what I believe about this situation. I know that Mark Glenn, who started this Crescent and Cross ministry some years ago, who's been involved with the Ugly Truth radio broadcast in more recent years, has identified this as the basic issue. I think the caller is saying what I believe, and that is that we're dealing in the West with post-Christian societies. Post-Christian societies are largely anti-Christian societies, and yet paradoxically, this war on Islam that is being conducted by these Jewish neoconservatives is being sold to the unsuspecting so-called Christian in the United States as a war that the Christian has a stake in because the enemy is Islam. The enemy is Islam in the ultimate sense of the word. The enemy is the system of the beast, which I think the New Testament quite clearly indicates is tied up with the synagogue of Satan and an individual who will rule from a rebuilt temple in Jerusalem, mimicking a reign of what Christians would call the Messiah, Jesus Christ, mimicking that, counterfeiting that, and so in a way that will be very, very sophisticated. And again, when we ask who benefits by all of this, it's clear who benefits. It's the globalists, it's the New World Order, it's the Zionist element that wins in this. And the first caller is fundamentally correct in that when you look at how effectively the Christian societies of the West have been brought down through moral infiltration and sexual perversion, it's clear that the basic obstacle that the minions of the New World Order face in bringing it to pass right now comes from the Islamic world, and comes from an Islamic world that will be far more presumably unified, at least in this generation, in trying to oppose what these people would love to do to their families and to their mosques and to their communities. Now, if they're unsuccessful in doing that from within, unlike in the West where they were very successful in doing it, then what would be an alternative strategy? An alternative strategy, getting back to Jesus' theme of wars and rumors of war and deception in the end times, the New World Order globalist crowd would like nothing better than to drag millions of unsuspecting Christians into a war against Islam and a war on Islam.
Right.
The end game of which would be to destroy millions of people on both sides of that divide. And if that's accomplished through the manipulation of forces to create an overt shooting contest, then obviously who would win? I think that's when the globalists would really win, because there would no longer be any effective mass opposition to their agenda. And when I look at the United States, and I talk about this with Mark Glenn a lot, and with some of the better people in the so-called American populist movement, the people who are opposed to the New World Order, they oppose Zionism. Many of them, not all of them, many of them are Christians, some are not. But when we look at all of this, and when we discuss how marginalized we are as individuals and how marginalized our movement has become, not only since the end of the Second World War, but since the 1960s and the victory of the drug and sexual revolutions in the United States, this explains, and I think that the first caller will understand this easily, this explains why some of these American populists, some of whom have Christian backgrounds, Mark Glenn's a Roman Catholic, I'm an evangelical Lutheran, we're on press television in Iran, which is the state network of a Shia Islamic country. Why do they have us on there? They have us on there because they think we have something to say, and I'm sure our theological views are not something that they would endorse, but they understand that coming from our theological perspective, we have a goal that we share with them, and that is the avoidance of annihilation at the hands of the beast. And to quote John in Revelation 13, that's what's going on here. And most of our countrymen have been bought off by this, have been deceived by this. The so-called Christian churches in the United States, between overt liberalism, which is another subject for another show in regard to how all of that infiltrated Christian graduate schools and Christian churches in the United States since the 19th century. When you look at the liberal leftist churches, whose gospel is basically a neo-Marxist gospel, and then when you look at these Christian Zionist churches, which look like conservative Bible-believing churches, that's what they allegedly are, and yet they are teaching something that is so fundamentally deceptive that in the last analysis, they have become as dangerous to the real Christian as the liberal churches have become. So this leaves people like Mark Glenn, Mark Dankof, Michael Collins Piper, E. Michael Jones, Robert Sungenis, and folks like that appearing on press television in Iran and outlets like that, because we have largely been deliberately shut out by a Zionist takeover of the basic institutions of our own country, including the media.
Mark, I'm sorry, they're already telling me our time is up. And
very good.
Thank you very much for all your inputs. This interview is cut. Hopefully we can continue next week.
Well, thank you.
Because we have to really continue these inputs and righteous preaching instead of Zionists. Thank you for coming one more time. Սիրելի հայրենակիցներ, եղբայրներ, քույրեր, ինչպես որ այսօրվա հայդակիրը տեսակ անգլերենով է, կփորձենք այս անգլերենով հայդակիրը թարգմանել հայերենի վարը գրված շատ շուտով YouTube-ի վրա տնենք։ Շնորհակալություն, մինչև քաշապատ Աստված ձեզ հետ։